Hey guys, tonight we will unveil the secrets behind a marriage written in blood and ambition, a great love story that tore the foundations of England apart and ended on the scaffold. Imagine this. Anne Boleyn, just moments away from facing the sharpest sword in all of Europe, summoned from France as a final act of mercy by the husband who was once her most ardent lover, Henry VIII. The king whom Anne had so enchanted that he broke with the Catholic Church, betrayed his lawful queen, and shook an entire continent, is now the very man who signed her death warrant. This is more than just history. This is a tale of betrayal, of absolute power transforming love into obsession, and of the ultimate price paid for being the woman the king most desired. What turned a passionate romance into an unsalvageable political tragedy? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. For us to begin this journey together, please let me know where you are watching from and what time it is on your clock right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was early morning inside the royal apartments of the Tower of London. The air was still, heavy with that strange quiet which always falls before a great ending. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England and wife of King Henry VIII, awoke to her final dawn. Her ladies-in-waiting moved softly around her, their hands trembling as they prepared her for what was to come. They arranged her hair beneath a linen coif, adjusted the folds of her grey gown, and whispered short prayers that caught in their throats. Before the clock struck 8, they were dismissed, ordered to leave her chambers in silence. At the end of the short journey that awaited her stood a man famed throughout Europe for his skill with a sword, a master executioner from Calais, summoned across the Channel by royal command. His blade, sharp as a razor, was said to take a head so cleanly that the victim felt no pain. The king had called him not out of cruelty, but as a final gesture of mercy toward the woman for whom he had once risked everything, and whom he now believed had betrayed him. Anne's story, like Henry's, has long been shrouded in myth, romance, and contradiction. For centuries they have been remembered through fragments, half-truths whispered by courtiers, embroidered by poets, and exaggerated by time. Henceforth, Henry once wrote to her, "My heart shall be dedicated to you alone." But history would turn that promise into an irony. What began as passion would end as punishment. This, then, is the story the narrator begins to tell. Not the tale of monsters and martyrs, but of two human beings whose love altered the course of a kingdom. The question that guides the journey is quiet and persistent. We all know how the tragedy ends, but do we truly know who they were? To find answers, the path leads first away from the tower, into the gentle countryside of Kent, where Anne's life began. The camera moves through rolling green fields toward Hever Castle, the seat of the Boleyn family. There, her childhood unfolded among orchards and moats, within the red brick walls that still breathe of Tudor splendour. It was in these rooms that her story began long before the crown, the trial, and the sword. Anne's family was far from humble. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a respected diplomat, a member of the King's Council, and later ambassador to France. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, came from noble lineage daughter of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Together they raised 3 children who survived into adulthood: Mary, Anne, and George. The eldest, Mary, would one day briefly become Henry's mistress. The youngest, George, a bright and witty companion to Anne, would share her fate in death. From her earliest years, Anne was surrounded by learning, culture, and ambition. She grew up speaking French and Latin, skilled in music, dancing, and embroidery qualities expected of a gentlewoman, but in her they took on something keener. People would later describe her as spirited, intelligent, quick to laughter, a free soul not easily subdued by courtly restraint. Yet the real Anne remains elusive. No diary survives, no private journal reveals her thoughts. Only a few letters formal, careful, written with a diplomat's precision hint at the depth beneath the poise. Still, standing at Hever, one feels that thin veil between past and present. It is as though time, not space, separates us from her. The halls she walked, the chapel where she prayed, the garden where she read each carries the ghost of her footsteps. The narrator's voice lowers, almost to a whisper. When you come to a place like this, where she actually lived. You sense how the centuries bend. The silence is not empty, it remembers. Among the few relics of her life, one stands out. Her Book of Hours. It is a small, jewel-like manuscript of prayers and devotions, richly illuminated in gold and blue. Such books were popular across 16th century Europe, cherished for both their beauty and piety. This one, kept at Hever, was almost certainly held by Anne's own hands. Touching it feels like touching a heartbeat preserved in vellum. On one of its pages, near an image of Christ rising from the grave, she wrote in French, "Le temps viendra, je Anne Boleyn." The time will come, I, Anne Boleyn. No one knows exactly when she wrote those words, or what she meant by them. Perhaps she thought of Judgment Day, as the image suggests. Many in the 16th century believed they were living in the world's final days. Or perhaps she meant something more earthly, a prophecy of her own destiny, a quiet promise to herself that her time, her moment would come. The inscription feels prophetic now. Within little more than 2 decades, that time would indeed come, raising her to a crown, then leading her back here, to this tower, beneath the very blade that glitters in the morning Sunday. Yet in this opening chapter, we do not see her as a condemned queen. We see her as a young woman whose faith was sincere, whose ambition was real, and whose life was still filled with the soft sounds of Kentish birdsong and the rustle of pages turned in prayer. As the narrator closes the book, the candlelight trembles. The music fades into a low hum, like the breath between waking and sleep. The story of Anne Boleyn has begun not with a scream, but with a whisper. At Hever Castle, deep in the gentle countryside of Kent, Thomas Boleyn and his wife Elizabeth Howard raised their 3 surviving children, Mary, Anne, and George. The Boleyns were not of ancient royal blood, but they were far from ordinary. Thomas, an educated man of ambition and wit, served as one of King Henry VIII's trusted courtiers. He sat on the King's Council, represented England as ambassador to the court of France, and through both marriage and merit, secured a respected position among the rising gentry of Tudor England. Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, came from one of the oldest noble families in the realm. Together, they wove their family name into the tapestry of power that surrounded the throne. Mary, the eldest, would one day catch the king's eye for a fleeting moment, a brief affair, soon forgotten. George, the youngest, was lively and clever, a companion to Anne in both childhood and later years. And between them, the middle child, Anne, began to form the quick mind and quiet fire that would one day shake a kingdom. The world around her was one of privilege. Hever Castle, with its stone walls and water-filled moat, was a sanctuary of refinement. Here, music floated through long galleries. Prayers echoed in the small chapel. Lessons in language, deportment, and faith filled each day. Anne was taught to read and write in both English and French, and she learned the arts that defined a lady of status: singing, dancing, embroidery, and the skill of holding one's silence when words might wound. Her father's work as ambassador meant that she grew up surrounded by talk of courts and kings, of alliances and letters sealed with wax. Yet for all that, the real Anne remains a mystery. The few surviving documents of her youth, brief letters, careful family records, tell us little of her inner world. There are no diaries, no confessions, no glimpses of private laughter or tears. What we think we know of her wit, her charm, her sharpness of mind, comes from those who wrote after her death, through layers of rumour and revision. She has become, even in her own lifetime, a figure half seen through fog, part saint, part temptress, part ambition made flesh. And yet, in Hever's quiet rooms, something of her still lingers. The light falls through the same mullioned windows. The scent of damp stone is the same. The sound of distant bells carries across the orchard. To walk here is to feel the centuries thin, to sense that time itself has grown transparent. The narrator's voice softens. It is not the distance that separates us from her, but the silence she left behind. Among the few objects that truly belong to Anne, one stands apart. A small illuminated prayer book, her Book of Hours. Bound in leather, its pages shimmer with gold and azure, filled with miniature scenes of saints and angels. Such books were prized possessions across 16th century Europe, symbols of devotion, but also of learning and taste. This one, preserved at Hever, bears the faint traces of her fingers along its edges, as though the oils of her skin had become part of the vellum itself. For those who hold it today, the experience is strangely intimate. To touch it is to meet her not the queen, not the condemned prisoner, but the young woman who prayed by candlelight and whispered her own name in ink. On one page, beside a delicate image of Christ rising above the tomb, she wrote a short inscription in French: "Le temps viendra. Je, Anne Boleyn." The time will come. I, Anne Boleyn. The words are small, their meaning immense. No one knows precisely when she wrote them or what she intended. The page depicts the resurrection Christ lifted toward heaven, while small figures below rise from their graves. It may have been a meditation on Judgment Day, when the faithful would be redeemed and the world remade. Many in the 16th century believed they lived in the world's final days, the threshold of the second coming. But the narrator offers another possibility, quieter and more human. Perhaps the words were not about the end of the world, but about the beginning of her own. "The time will come," she wrote, not if, but will. It is the language of someone certain of her path, someone who feels destiny breathing just beyond the horizon. Perhaps Anne, even then, believed herself meant for greatness not through vanity, but through the clear sense that her life would not remain confined to the orchards and moats of Kent. Still, how could she have imagined what that destiny would demand? That it would draw her into the orbit of the most powerful man in the realm, a king already married, and make her both his love and his ruin. The book rests open on the table, its gold leaf glinting faintly under the flicker of a single candle. The camera lingers on the inscription, those fragile letters that have outlived their writer by almost 500 years. Hever, in this moment, is no longer just a home. It is a beginning, a prophecy, and a promise. The girl who once knelt here at her prayers would one day stand before a crown, and then before a sword. But on this quiet morning, she knows none of that. She only knows that the time will come. Outside, the garden stirs with birdsong. The moat mirrors the pale English sky, and the world is still unbroken. The narrator's voice fades to a murmur. In this house of stone and silence, a single line written in faith became the seed of everything that followed. In the last years of his life, King Henry VIII became a figure of fear, bloated, brutal, and unpredictable, ruling with a temper that could crush anyone who defied him. But it was not always so. When he first ascended the throne in the year 1509, he was only 17 years old, and England saw in him not a tyrant, but a golden prince. For the first 2 decades of his reign, Henry dazzled all who met him. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall, when the average man was barely 5 feet and 7.5. His hair was a deep, burnished auburn, his skin pale, his eyes a brilliant grey-blue. He moved with athletic ease, strong in the shoulders, quick on horseback, precise with a bow. He hunted from dawn till dusk, jousted with his courtiers, and played tennis with a grace that astonished foreign envoys. The Venetian ambassador wrote home in wonder, "His face is so beautiful that if he were a woman, he would be the fairest in the world." And it was not only his looks that charmed. Henry's manners were gracious, his laughter infectious, his presence warm. Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, described him as a man of gentle friendship and debate, one who harms no one. To his companions, he was more a friend than a sovereign. When he entered a room, it was said, it felt as though the sun had come in with him. This was the Henry of promise, the humanist king who composed music, wrote poetry, and dreamed of a realm enlightened by learning and virtue. But beneath that glow, a shadow had already begun to form, one born of the oldest and most sacred duty of kingship, to provide a son, a legitimate heir, who would secure the Tudor dynasty for generations to come. Henry himself had not been destined to wear the crown. He was the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His elder brother, Prince Arthur, had been the hope of the realm, a boy raised to rule. But in the year 1502, at the age of 15, Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle, likely of the sweating sickness. His death changed everything. The young Henry, barely 11 years old, was pulled from his quiet studies and thrust into the path of destiny. When his father died in April of 1509, the 17-year-old Henry became king. Within weeks, he chose to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Their wedding took place on the 11th of June that same year, and they were crowned together at Westminster Abbey soon after. For many years, theirs was a union of affection and respect. Catherine was 6 years his senior, but wise, learned, and deeply pious. Henry adored her, calling her the most virtuous woman that ever lived. Together they presided over a glittering court where music, dance, and chivalric sport flourished. Yet beneath the splendor ran a single haunting question. Could she give him a son? Over the course of their more than 20 years of marriage, Catherine conceived at least 6 times. Each pregnancy carried hope, and each ended in heartbreak. Several children were stillborn. One boy, named Henry, lived only 52 days. Only a single child survived infancy, a daughter, Princess Mary, born in February of 1516. In the eyes of Tudor England, a female heir was no heir at all. A queen regnant could marry a foreign prince, and through that marriage England might fall under the sway of another power. France and Spain were constant rivals, and the island kingdom, smaller and less wealthy, could not afford to risk its independence. The continuation of the dynasty required a male heir, an heir and a spare, as the saying went. As the years passed and Catherine grew older, Henry's disappointment deepened into obsession. He began to see his misfortune not as chance, but as punishment. His conscience, once calm, grew tormented by a single verse from the book of Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. To Henry, the words struck with divine authority. He had broken a sacred law, and God himself had cursed his marriage. When he brought his doubt to the scholars and theologians who surrounded his court, they confirmed what he already feared, though they softened the verdict. Childless, they explained, meant not without children, but without sons. And Henry had indeed been denied sons. The thought consumed him. To be king and yet fail in the one task for which kings existed continuity was a torment he could not bear. He believed that his immortal soul was at risk, that the sin of his marriage might damn him. As the sleepless nights multiplied, his faith, his pride, and his fear braided together into a single, desperate resolve. It was this spiritual unease, more than lust or politics, that would drive him toward the woman who seemed, to his fevered mind, both remedy and temptation. Anne Boleyn. In her, Henry would imagine salvation a fresh beginning, a union blessed by heaven. Yet in reaching for that hope, he would ignite the greatest upheaval in England's religious history, severing his kingdom from Rome and setting himself upon the path that would, in time, turn the golden prince into the monstrous king. The narrator's voice softens as if speaking into the dark. Before the crown grew heavy, before the heart grew cruel, there was a young man who only wished for a son. It was that wish and that wound that would undo them all. I'm quote, as a young woman, Anne Boleyn crossed the sea and stepped into another world. She left England for the Low Countries, where she spent time in the refined household of Archduchess Margaret of Austria. It was there, in the court of Mechlin, that she first tasted the polish and diplomacy of continental life. The year was 1508. Anne was likely no older than 12, already bright and observant, and her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, saw this placement as the perfect beginning for a daughter destined to rise. But the true transformation began soon after, when she journeyed south into France. There, at the court of King Francis I, Anne's life opened like a page of illuminated script, each line gilded with art, intellect, and charm. This period, though sparsely recorded, shaped everything she would become. Contemporary writers later called her the mirror of the French court, for what she learned there would define her speech, her movement, and even her understanding of power. At Blois, one of Francis's magnificent residences, the air was thick with beauty. The chateau itself stood as a living testament to the French Renaissance. Soaring facades, spiral staircases that seemed to twist into the heavens, sculpted columns adorned with mythic figures. This was not England's grey austerity, but a realm of light and motion music echoing through stone, laughter flowing through gardens. For a girl of Anne's curiosity, it was intoxicating. She entered the household of Queen Claude of France, the devout and gentle wife of Francis. Claude, though frail in body, was strong in spirit and fertile beyond measure, bearing 7 children in 8 years, 3 of them sons. In an age when a woman's worth was measured by her womb, she was the model of virtue and success. The English court would one day revere such a queen, chaste, pious, obedient, and fruitful. Claude's example would stay with Anne, a quiet reminder of what her own people desired most in a royal consort. Despite later rumours, the court Anne entered was not the den of licentious intrigue some have imagined. Historians have found little evidence that it was the school of seduction often described by her enemies. Rather, it was a place where refinement was prized above all. The French court under Francis I was the epicentre of European culture, alive with conversation, art, and the music of new ideas. Francis himself adored the Renaissance. He brought artists and scholars to France, among them Leonardo da Vinci, who spent his final years just a few miles away at Amboise, dying there in 1519. It is possible, though not certain, that Anne saw the old master in his last days, an image that lingers like a half-remembered dream. The young English maid passing through a hall where Leonardo's sketches rested drying in the sunlight. During her years there, Anne learned not merely languages or manners, but an entire philosophy of presence. She spoke French fluently, moved with precision, and mastered the subtle art of conversation, how to flatter without fawning, how to answer with wit yet remain modest. She learned music, the lute and virginals, and danced with a grace that would later captivate an English king. Her education was not just that of a lady, but of a woman prepared to be seen. She may have attended major events, including the diplomatic gathering of 1518, and perhaps even the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where Francis I and Henry VIII met amid tents of silk and gold to display their splendour. Some accounts suggest that Anne served as an interpreter between the French and English delegations, a sign of her quick mind and adaptability. Years later, an observer would write of her, "No one would ever have taken her to be English by her manners, but a native-born Frenchwoman." It was the highest praise possible, for to be French in that era meant to embody grace, intelligence, and ease, the very qualities that would make her unforgettable in the rigid world of Tudor England. From this time also survives one of Anne's earliest known letters, written to her father. In it, she thanks him for his guidance, and expresses delight that Queen Claude will take the trouble to converse with me. She signs herself, "Your very humble and obedient daughter, Anna de Boleyn." The letter reveals her ambition, cloaked in humility, and her longing to make a worthy impression. The narrator pauses here, voice slow and drowsy. She was learning the rhythm of power, the dance between obedience and influence, between silence and speech. She was learning how to exist at the very edge of the sun without burning. By the time she returned to England in her early 20s, Anne was transformed. She was no longer a provincial girl from Kent, but a woman of Europe, cultivated, complex, fluent in charm and faith alike. Those who met her found her unlike any English woman they had ever known. She was pious yet worldly, innocent yet discerning, humble yet radiant with self-possession. She could sing, play, dance, and converse with a brilliance that made courtiers pause mid-step. She spoke the language of art, of politics, of poetry, and above all, she carried herself as one who knew her own worth. The narrator closes this chapter with the soft echo of her own prophecy. "The time will come. I, Anne Boleyn." In France, it had begun to come true. The French court had carved her from raw promise into poise, had tempered faith with wit, and had taught her that grace could be as sharp as steel. She left that world behind, but it would never leave her. When her ship set sail from Calais back to England, the sea wind tangled her dark hair, and the bells of Blois faded into silence. Behind her lay the Renaissance. Ahead, a throne and a fate written long before she could read it aloud. In her early 20s, Anne Boleyn returned to England, no longer the young girl who had left Kent, but a woman polished by years at the courts of Europe. London was loud, crowded, alive with ambition. King Henry VIII kept residence across a constellation of palaces, but the beating heart of his reign was Hampton Court, the grand estate that still stands today on the banks of the Thames. Of all the places where her story would unfold, This was the one that still whispers most clearly of her presence. At the time of Anne's arrival in the year 1522, Hampton Court was among the most splendid palaces in England. Its red brick walls stretched wide, filled with the scent of rushes and beeswax, with galleries bright from torchlight and laughter. The court of Henry VIII was not a single household, but a vast city in miniature. At its fullest, it could hold nearly 1,000 souls, nobles, soldiers, scholars, and servants. Of these, about 200 were women attached to the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon, each with her rank, her duties, and her secrets. Anne entered this world as one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. Her role was both humble and privileged. She read aloud to Catherine, embroidered linen beside her, carried her messages, shared her prayers, and kept her company through long hours of devotion and ceremony. To serve the Queen meant proximity to power and to danger. The Queen's chambers were the quiet centre of a storm that raged between factions, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors. Within those walls, Anne learned to listen, to measure her words, and to survive by grace as much as by intellect. Life at a Tudor court was a strange balance between ritual and play. It was a theatre of politics, gilded by masks of chivalry. Each day moved between solemn mass and flirtatious dance, between whispered counsel and staged entertainment. Love, in this setting, was rarely about the heart. Courtly affection was a game, a dance of glances and riddles, a form of currency. To flirt was to negotiate. To be noticed was to rise. The courtiers themselves called it courtly love, though beneath its poetry ran the pulse of ambition. Henry, still vigorous in those years, participated in this game with relish. He was not the womanizer that his French counterpart Francis I was reputed to be, but he was no saint. When Queen Catherine became pregnant, a time when superstition forbade marital intimacy, Henry took discreet mistresses. In the year 1519, one such affair produced a son. The mother was Elizabeth Bessie Blount, a lady of the Queen's chamber. The boy was named Henry Fitzroy, his surname meaning son of the king. It was the clearest sign possible that the problem of heirs did not lie with Henry himself. By the time Anne joined the Queen's household, another Boleyn had already caught the royal eye. Mary, Anne's elder sister, had become the king's mistress some years earlier. The affair, though brief, left its mark. When it ended, Mary was quietly married off to William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. The lesson was obvious. Royal favour was dazzling but fleeting, Anne observed. She watched the court revolve around the king's moods, the smiles that advanced one family, the silences that destroyed another. She learned that power was a candle's flame, bright, beautiful, and gone in a breath. It was likely in the early months of 1526 that Henry first turned his gaze upon Anne. By then, she had become one of the most talked-about women at court. Her French education, her wit, her graceful hands, and the glint of confidence in her dark eyes set her apart from the pale, silent ladies around her. Henry was intrigued. Soon, small tokens began to appear: jewels, ribbons, trinkets meant to delight and to signal royal interest. One gift, now preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, captures the playfulness of that early pursuit. A tiny golden pendant in the shape of a whistle. It was no ordinary ornament. The whistle also contained a toothpick and an ear scoop, an intimate, curious object that suggested closeness. Its message was unmistakable. If you whistle, I will come. And from these gestures grew letters, dozens of them, written in the king's own hand, copies of which survive today in the Vatican Library. They reveal not the cold command of a monarch, but the tender yearning of a man in love. My own sweetheart, one begins, this should be to advertise you of the great loneliness I find since your departing. In another, he signs himself Henry Rex, beneath a heart with the letter B drawn inside. The words are impulsive, urgent, almost boyish, yet the story told by history has often been unkind to Anne. Because her replies have not survived, many later imagined that she played the part of the coquette, that she withheld affection to increase desire. that she trapped the king with cunning and pride. But the narrator's tone softens, almost sleepy. Perhaps it was not a game at all. Perhaps they both waited not from manipulation, but from fear of doing wrong. Henry's longing was more than passion. It was entangled with faith and duty. To make Anne his mistress would have been easy, but to make her his wife, legitimate and crowned, would mean everything. Both knew that only marriage could make her child, if she bore one, an heir to the throne. To fall before that marriage was sealed would destroy them both. And so they waited. Beneath the glitter of Hampton Court, beneath the music, the masks, and the laughter of courtiers, something quiet and irreversible began. Love, like a small flame, took hold in the dark. In the hush of those candlelit chambers, a man wrote letters that would change a nation, and a woman read them, weighing not only her heart, but her future. The great machine of history began to turn, softly at first, as if in sleep. Before long, the private matter of two souls would become the king's great matter, a question that would tear apart England's faith, crown, and conscience. But for now, at Hampton Court, all was music and murmurs, and the whisper of a king's promise. My heart shall be dedicated to you alone. The letters that King Henry VIII wrote to Anne Boleyn, those fragile windows into a monarch's heart, survive today only as copies, preserved in the Vatican Library. Their words, though 5 centuries old, still pulse with warmth and restlessness. In them, we see not the ruthless king of later years, but a man undone by longing. He writes, with the eagerness of a lover, not a ruler, "My heart I put in your hands. Would that I were now in yours, that I might lie in your sweet arms." Each letter closes with the same anxious tenderness, written by the hand of him who was, is, and shall be yours, Henry Rex. In one, he doodles a tiny heart, and inside it the letter B, a schoolboy's sketch from the most powerful hand in Europe. The contrast is almost childlike, almost touching. The King of England reduced to the simplicity of a man who waits for a reply. His gifts were no less peculiar symbols of affection and invitation wrapped in mischief. Among them, the small golden pendant shaped like a whistle, now resting in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It is no larger than a thumb, decorated with tiny leaves, and inside it hides both an ear scoop and a toothpick. It could whistle softly, almost secretively, and the message was unmistakable. Whistle, and I will come. But in the midst of this playful courtship, death moved quietly across England. In the summer of 1528, a wave of the sweating sickness that swift and terrifying plague swept through the country. It struck suddenly. Fever, delirium, and death within hours. Rich and poor alike fell to it, and no one understood its cause. When the disease reached London, the court scattered. Anne fled from danger, returning to the safety of her family home at Hever Castle. Henry, though desperate for news of her, was forced to remain apart. The letters stopped. It is in this silence that the legends began. Historians of later centuries would say that Anne played hard to get, that she withheld her affections to ensnare the king, that her coolness made him burn hotter. But the narrator's voice softens into a sigh. There is no proof of this, only the echo of envy and invention. A more honest reading is quieter, more human. Both Anne and Henry knew the stakes. Henry's desire was not only for love, but for legitimacy. He needed a lawful wife to bear him a lawful son, a prince beyond dispute, one who would secure the Tudor line. To take Anne as a mistress, as he had taken others, would doom her to ruin, and the child to bastardy. If she conceived before they were married, the king's great matter, his quest for a lawful heir, would collapse before it began. And so, they waited. At Hever, Anne recovered slowly. The sweating sickness spared her life but left her weak, surrounded by the scent of herbs and prayers whispered through sleepless nights. Her old book of hours lay open beside her bed, its familiar pages smudged with use. In those long days of fever and recovery, she learned patience, the hardest lesson of all. The woman who would one day ignite a reformation spent those weeks doing nothing but breathing, healing, waiting. Meanwhile, Henry hunted. He rode across the royal parks, his courtiers cheering as he loosed arrows at deer, as if movement could silence his yearning. Between hunts and games of tennis, he sent small gifts to Hever, venison from his own kill, folded with letters that began, "To my mistress," and ended with some tender word, "Remember your hunter." The narrator's tone falls to a hush, almost drowsy, like a lullaby. Their love was both secret and known. Everyone whispered, yet no one saw. It was as though the entire kingdom held its breath. The affair had reached its crossroads. For years, Henry's heart had been divided between his duty to Catherine of Aragon and his passion for Anne. But the waiting had changed him. It had turned desire into determination. And Anne, who might have withdrawn like her sister before her, instead stood firm. She would not be mistress, only wife. It was a choice that would define them both. To remain in the shadows, as so many courtly loves had done, was to live safely and die forgotten. But to step into the light to seek legitimacy, to defy the church itself, was to risk everything. Together, they chose the second path, not because they thought it easy, but because they believed it right. For Henry, it was the path to a son, to salvation, to a divine mandate. For Anne, it was the only way to preserve her dignity and her faith. Between them, they began to imagine a world remade, a world where the king himself could command not only the throne, but the church that blessed it. The music beneath the narration fades low, almost to silence. In the solitude of Hever, Anne closes her prayer book and looks out over the mist rising from the moat. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a king is writing her name again and again on parchment, surrounded by the flicker of candlelight. Soon those words, those simple, trembling letters, will tear apart a marriage, a church, and a kingdom. But tonight, they are still just love letters. The narrator whispers the final line of the chapter, slow as a breath before sleep. Every empire begins with a heartbeat, and every tragedy with a promise kept too well. No English king before Henry VIII had ever sought to cast aside a crowned queen. The act, when spoken aloud, sounded deceptively simple, an annulment, a remarriage. But in truth it was an earthquake. To end his union with Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn was to defy the foundations of law, religion, and custom that bound all of Christendom together. The court whispered its new name for this unfolding storm, the King's Great Matter. At first it seemed a problem that might be solved with theatre. In those early years, the royal court became a stage upon which the king's desire for freedom was played in allegory. One performance, the play of the weather, mocked Catherine with cruel laughter. In it, Jupiter, the king of the gods, complains of his leaky old moon and boasts of finding a newer, brighter one to light his skies. The audience understood the metaphor instantly. Catherine was the old moon, her youth and fertility spent. Anne was the new, fresh, luminous, and full of promise. The courtiers applauded, the musicians played, and beneath the laughter ran the echo of something darker. What began as jest was, in truth, a royal declaration. Change was coming, and the Queen would be replaced. But ridicule could not rewrite the law of God. England was still a Catholic realm, and its marriages, especially those of kings, fell under the jurisdiction of Rome. To end his marriage, Henry needed more than jest. He needed permission from the Pope. In the summer of 1529, a special ecclesiastical court was convened in England to examine the question. The matter was presented formally. Could the king's marriage to his brother's widow be lawful in the eyes of God? The court's roll call glittered with authority, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey presiding, alongside Archbishop William Warham of Canterbury and the bishops of Ely, London, Bath and Exeter. Each affixed their seals to solemn documents written in Latin and laced with hesitation. Henry's argument rested on scripture. He claimed that his marriage to Catherine had brought him torment of both body and conscience. He cited the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 16. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. And again in chapter 20, verse 21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. For Henry, these words were not metaphor but curse. His marriage was invalid, his heirless state a divine punishment. The records of that court still survive, sealed and stamped in wax. Among the signatures is one that would later become infamous. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. Fisher, a learned and pious man, had long been a close adviser to the king, yet when this document appeared, he declared his signature a forgery. He had never approved the divorce, he said. He considered the Queen's marriage sacred and binding. His defiance was calm, unwavering and fatal. In the years to come, Fisher's loyalty to Catherine and to Rome would cost him his life. He would die, as so many did in Henry's reign, upon the scaffold. But in that moment, in 1529, the blade was still far away. For now, the ink was enough to wound. The narrator's tone slows to a whisper. History bends toward power, but it does not forget the shape of those it breaks. As the proceedings dragged on, Henry's frustration deepened. Cardinal Wolsey, once the king's most trusted servant, failed to deliver the verdict his master desired. Rome hesitated. Pope Clement VII, trapped between political debts to Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, and the demands of the English crown, delayed his decision. Every month that passed felt like mockery. Henry raged. He wrote more letters, summoned more scholars, and swore that his conscience could no longer bear the sin. In his view, the question was not about lust or rebellion. It was about the salvation of his soul and the safety of his dynasty. Yet every prayer, every legal argument, every whispered persuasion led him deeper into the same dead end. By the end of that year, the court's verdict had not come. Instead, suspicion and fear began to spread like cracks across marble. The Queen refused to yield her title. Anne remained apart, waiting, and Wolsey, unable to secure the annulment, fell from grace. Behind the bright facades of Whitehall and Hampton Court, the corridors darkened. The courtiers spoke in murmurs. The air grew heavy with the scent of wax and betrayal. The king's passion for Anne had become more than love. It was now the axis upon which his kingdom turned. Each step Henry took toward Anne cut another thread that bound him to Rome, to his counsellors, and to the moral certainty he once possessed. In the shadowed halls of Whitehall, love and politics had fused so tightly that they could no longer be separated. The narrator's voice lowers, slow and hypnotic. He had begun by seeking a son. He ended by seeking deliverance. The play had ended. The jest had turned to judgment. What followed would be no performance. It would be real blood, real loss, real crowns stripped from trembling heads. And in that gathering darkness, the king who once glowed like the sun now began to forge his own eclipse. The path out of stalemate came not from a council chamber, but from a small, tattered book, its pages creased and smudged by constant reading. The title was The Obedience of a Christian Man, written by the English reformer William Tyndale. Within its worn covers lay words that would change not only a king's heart, but the soul of a nation. Tyndale's argument was simple, yet revolutionary. Scripture, he said, was the supreme authority higher than any man, higher even than the Pope. No earthly priest could stand between God and his people. Every believer had the right to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. And above all, kings were answerable to God alone. As Tyndale wrote, "The king is judge over all, and over him there is no judge." For Henry VIII, this idea was not just theology, it was revelation. The story, repeated in many chronicles, goes that Anne Boleyn herself placed the book in his hands. She had already read it, fascinated by its daring challenge to Rome. When Henry opened its pages, the words struck him like light through stained glass. "This is the book for me," he is said to have exclaimed, "and for all kings to read." Itr. That sentence, half enthusiasm, half epiphany, became the hinge of English history. In Tyndale's theology, Henry saw the mirror of his own nature. The thought that the king himself could stand as the supreme head of his realm, both temporal and spiritual, fit perfectly with his conviction that God had chosen him to rule directly, without intercession. If the Pope's authority was false, then he no longer needed to beg Rome for an annulment. The solution had been waiting in plain sight. If the king is the church's head, the king may grant his own freedom. From that idea, the transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Over the next 3 years, England began to loosen its chains from Rome. Piece by piece, law by law, the crown absorbed the powers that once belonged to the church. Monasteries that had reported to the Vatican now bowed to Westminster. Bishops swore allegiance not to the Pope, but to the king. In a single heartbeat of history, divine authority had been redrawn upon English soil. The narrator's voice lowers, slow as a prayer. And thus, from a single book read in candlelight, a new faith was born. Yet this was no gentle birth. It was a gamble of impossible scale. Henry's break with Rome risked isolation from the Catholic powers of Europe, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and even France. War was a constant shadow. England stood small and alone, a single island defying centuries of religious order. To survive, Henry needed allies. And so, in December of 1532, he and Anne crossed the Channel to France. Their goal was clear: to secure the friendship and approval of King Francis I. The meeting took place at Calais, that fragile English foothold on French soil. After 7 years of waiting, 7 years of negotiation, longing and frustration, Henry and Anne appeared together not as whispering lovers, but as something far closer to husband and wife. The French court, glittering under winter frost, received them warmly. Francis, though cautious, agreed to recognize Anne as Henry's consort in all but name. It was a quiet triumph, a diplomatic blessing that gave Henry the confidence he needed. When left Calais to return to Dover, all evidence suggests that the long-delayed consummation of their love had finally taken place. Historians are careful with their words, but the truth lies between the lines. By the time they set sail across the Channel, Anne was no longer merely a promise, she was a partner. It was not a moment of reckless passion, but of inevitability. For 7 years, every obstacle, political, spiritual, personal, had been moved aside. The theology was ready. The politics were aligned. The hearts were certain. The wind that carried them home that December was sharp and cold, rattling through the rigging like a ghost. But below deck, within the stillness of their cabin, warmth gathered two lives entwined in defiance of a world that said no. The king and his soon-to-be queen had crossed the final boundary. The narrator's tone drops to a whisper, almost hypnotic. And though no one could hear it, beneath the creak of wood and the hiss of winter sea, another sound began, a hum so deep it would echo through centuries. That hum was the birth of a new order. Henry's private act of love became a public act of revolution. From this union would come the Church of England, with the king as its supreme head. From this voyage across the Channel would rise a kingdom divided from Rome, and a monarch who believed himself chosen by God to rule not only his subjects' bodies, but their souls. They returned to Dover in the first days of January, 1533, with salt in their hair and fire in their eyes. Behind them lay the blessing of France. Before them, the wrath of Rome. But for a brief, vanishing moment, none of that mattered. The sea lay calm. The stars trembled over England's coast, and somewhere in the dark hold of the ship, a woman closed her eyes and felt the world change around her. 7 years of waiting had ended, and in the quiet rhythm of the waves, one could almost hear the beginning of a new faith, whispered like a vow. The king and his heart are now one. There exists another book of ours, a manuscript of Flemish beauty, bound in velvet and gilded like a Christmas dream. Its pages shimmer with saints and angels, its margins breathing with colour and light. Yet within this private devotion lies something far more intimate, the handwriting of a king and his future queen. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, perhaps never imagining that their words would one day be seen by strangers, turned this sacred book into a secret chapel of love. On one illuminated page, the man of sorrows, Ecce Homo, is depicted in painful glory. Christ stands stripped of his garments, his flesh flayed, his eyes raised toward heaven. Beneath that image, in a bold, dark hand, Henry wrote, "If you remember me in your prayers as strongly as I adore you, you shall never be forgotten, for I am yours forever, Henry Rex." By writing beneath the image of suffering, Henry cast himself in its shadow, a man who loved so intensely that his passion became a kind of wound. It is a curious mixture of piety and self-pity, a blending of religion and desire that only Henry could believe harmonious. The king, who saw himself as God's chosen instrument, also saw himself as Christ-like in his longing, a lover sanctified by pain. Anne's contribution was no less deliberate, nor less symbolic. She turned to the page of the Annunciation, the moment when the angel Gabriel told the Virgin Mary that she would bear a son. At the bottom of that page, in her fine, neat hand, Anne wrote 2 lines of verse, tender and quiet. By daily proof you shall me find, to be unto you both loving and kind. Her words, soft as a whisper, answered Henry's with calm assurance. His declaration of eternal possession, I am yours forever, met her promise of constancy. Each day you shall see my love. Together they formed a dialogue, 2 halves of a vow written not in a church before witnesses, but in the margins of a prayer book. The choice of images was no accident. Henry's page, the tortured Christ, spoke of sacrifice, endurance, and the suffering of devotion. Anne's the Annunciation spoke of hope, conception, and divine promise. Between them, the 2 pages became a symbolic marriage, a union of blood and blessing. The meaning is unmistakable. In choosing the Annunciation, Anne invoked not only the Virgin's obedience, but her fruitfulness. The angel's words, "You shall conceive and bear a son," were, for Henry, the promise he had prayed for across 20 years of disappointment. For Anne to write her vow beneath that image was to assure him that she too would bring forth a son, an heir to carry the Tudor name into eternity. The narrator's voice lowers to a hush, like a candle flickering low. 2 lines of ink, 2 hands trembling on the page. And yet those words were enough to turn faith inside out. In that moment, the private became political, the personal became national. A king's desire had clothed itself in scripture. What began as longing between 2 souls had already begun to reshape the laws of England. Outside the chambers where the book rested, the machinery of power still ground forward. Clerics debated, lawyers drafted decrees, and the nation waited in uneasy silence. But here, in this fragile manuscript, everything that mattered was already written. The rest was only consequence. When Henry set down his pen, the ink gleamed wetly against the gold leaf. When Anne finished hers, the page glowed with quiet balance, his agony, her promise. The 2 inscriptions did not merely rest on the same vellum. They spoke to one another, line to line, faith to faith. To touch those pages now is to feel the pulse of their secret, a mingling of love, ambition, and sanctity so intertwined that no historian can quite separate them. What the world would later call the English Reformation began not with the hammering of decrees or the breaking of monasteries, but with these words: a king's devotion beneath the image of Christ, and a woman's vow beneath the image of the Virgin. The narrator pauses. The room in which the manuscript lies is silent, save for the faint creak of its binding. "It is strange," the voice murmurs, "how the smallest gestures endure. Empires fall, faiths divide, but ink remains. And in these lines the past still breathes. Outside, the realm trembled on the brink of change. Within, the book waited, its gold leaf catching the light like the thin edge of dawn. Henry's declaration, 'I am yours forever,' and Anne's quiet promise, 'By daily proof you shall me find,' stood side by side, like 2 vows spoken beneath unseen arches. No trumpet sounded, no witnesses signed. Yet somewhere between devotion and defiance, between scripture and seduction, the fate of England turned. The narrator lets the final sentence fall like a sigh. Some promises are as thin as paper, yet strong enough to turn a kingdom's faith, to rewrite its creed, and to end one day in blood. Whitehall Palace, in those days, was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of corridors, galleries, and courtyards, stretching toward the Thames like a city enclosed within walls. There was a tilt-yard for jousting, tennis courts where the king's laughter once echoed, gardens thick with yew and rose, a great hall for feasting, and endless rows of private chambers, each alive with whispers. It was so vast that, by contemporary accounts, it surpassed even the Vatican in size. Today, almost all of it is gone. The fire of the year 1689 devoured the palace in a single roaring night, reducing its brick and oak to ash. Only a few fragments survive, buried beneath the feet of civil servants and cabinet ministers who now walk where monarchs once dreamed. But when one moves through those echoing corridors of the present, when the air seems to thicken with something old and unseen, It is still possible to feel the pulse of a January morning nearly 500 years ago. It was there, in the opening days of the year 1533, that Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were Wednesday. The ceremony was small, almost secret. Few witnesses, fewer words. Not out of shame nor deceit, but out of necessity. The king's great matter was not yet settled with Rome, and the legality of any new union still trembled in uncertainty. Silence, then, became its own kind of protection. A curtain drawn over a moment that would reshape history. There are no grand descriptions of that wedding, no pageantry recorded in the chronicles, only faint traces. A priest's brief account, a whisper of oaths exchanged, near at hand. Yet from that quiet beginning would rise the loudest consequences in English faith and monarchy. Anne was already with child. For 7 long years, 7 years of waiting, arguing, pleading, breaking, and rebuilding, this was the moment toward which every prayer had leaned. Now, as winter clouds hung over Whitehall, Anne's swelling belly was both prophecy and proof. The king's conscience was vindicated, his church reborn, his bloodline at last ready to continue. The narrator's voice softens, slow and low, like a lullaby whispered through frost. They had waited through storms, through sermons, through years of doubt. Now, they believed the promise was fulfilled. Music filled the palace, that winter soft strings drifting from the great hall, laughter rising from the gardens where frost glistened like powdered glass. Courtiers spoke in low voices of the Queen's condition. They counted weeks, then months, each moon a measure of hope. Surely this time, surely now, it would be a prince. Anne, radiant and restless, walked often to the tall windows overlooking the river. The air beyond was grey with mist and drizzle, the Thames curling like smoke beneath the bridge. Henry would sometimes stand beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers, his gaze set not on the water but on the horizon of destiny. Together, they believed love had conquered all that it had persuaded theology, bent politics, and remade the order of nations. The king had defied the Pope and the world for this union. He had risked excommunication, rebellion, and war. But here, in the hush of Whitehall, as the Queen's laughter drifted through candlelight, it all seemed worth it. The narrator pauses a long breath, heavy with foreboding. Every triumph hums with the shadow of its undoing. Even the brightest crown carries the scent of smoke. For now, though, the palace still stood unscathed. The tapestries glowed with gold thread, the fire crackled in the hearths, and Anne's belly carried the dream of an heir that might secure the realm forever. The king's courtiers flattered him with songs and poems, comparing him to David, to Solomon, to the sun itself. And Anne, the woman who had turned scripture into revolution, now wore the title of Queen. When the two stood by the window together, watching the fine English rain fall upon the gardens, they might have thought themselves invincible. The world beyond those walls, Rome, rebellion, envy, seemed far away. The narrator lowers their tone, like the closing bars of a lullaby. History allows us this one tender mercy to pause in the fragile hour before the fall. In that hour, Whitehall was still whole, its towers unblackened, its corridors warm with light. Anne's laughter still rang from chamber to chamber, bright and clear as bells. Her hand still rested on the curve of her stomach, her eyes still filled with quiet certainty. The dream of the little prince, the longed-for heir, shone over every bedchamber, every chapel, every banquet hall. It was the dream that had moved armies, shattered churches, and rewritten holy law. And so, in that still winter morning, the king and his queen stood together in the glow of everything they had fought to win, believing, perhaps, that love had triumphed, that faith had been remade in their image. Outside, rain gathered on the stone steps and dripped into the river, unhurried and endless. The voice of the narrator fades to near silence. All things are temporary, the fire, the gold, the promise. But for a moment before history caught its breath, the dream was alive. Oh, and for that one moment, Whitehall, vast as the Vatican, bright as heaven, belonged only to them. From the moment Anne Boleyn conceived, King Henry VIII believed that everything he had done, his defiance of the Pope, his break from Rome, his creation of a new church, had been ordained by God. In his mind, every act of rebellion was no longer rebellion at all, but revelation. The sleepless years of waiting, the storms of politics and excommunication, all were stepping stones laid by divine will. He saw himself now as England's deliverer, chosen to lead his people out of bondage to the Vatican and into the light of a purer faith. And at the heart of that faith stood Anne, his new Eve, carrying within her the seed of a new world. Their conviction was complete, and their joy absolute. Faith and pride entwined like vine and stone. Henry, who once wrote to her, "My heart I give you, my body God may take when he will," now turned that phrase into doctrine. His passion became a theology, his desire a justification for absolute power. If God had blessed their union with life, then God had blessed all that made it possible: the separation from Rome, the reshaping of England's soul. The narrator's voice lowers to a slow murmur. They believed not that they had sinned, but that they had been sanctified. Inside the palace, that belief spread like incense. The air of Whitehall grew thick with ritual and rumour, devotion and delirium. Courtiers spoke of Anne as though she were touched by heaven. To flatter the king was to praise the queen. To doubt her was to risk one's head. Painters hurried to immortalise her face. Everywhere, her likeness appeared on panel, in miniature, upon the walls of Hampton and Greenwich. Her dark eyes, her long neck, her faintly smiling mouth. They stared from every corner of the royal world. The falcon, her emblem of purity and grace, now adorned goblets, tapestries, and city gates. It was carved upon coins, embroidered upon banners, stamped upon letters sent to every shire. The symbol had once been gentle, a white bird poised upon a golden branch. Now beneath the king's command it gleamed like an omen. But beyond the palace, the world was not so dazzled. In the taverns of London and the cloisters of the north, murmurs turned to curses. Priests denounced the adulterous woman who bewitched the king. Fishermen at the river crossings spat when they spoke her name, and those who had once served Queen Catherine still prayed quietly for the old order's return. In candlelit chapels, the faithful knelt, whispering that the Lord must soon correct the king's error of judgment, that this pregnancy would end in sorrow, that heaven would not allow such sin to prosper. Yet inside Whitehall, the air was still heavy with hope. Anne glowed with expectancy. Her laughter rang through the painted galleries, mingling with the sound of lutes and viols. When she passed, courtiers bowed deeply, their eyes fixed upon the gentle curve of her body. Henry watched her every step, as if she were both miracle and prophecy. At night, he would kneel beside her bed, press his lips to her swelling belly, and murmur words of prayer disguised as adoration. In those whispered hours, he believed he was communing with both woman and God. "Our son," he would say, his voice trembling, "our prince, our heir." Each night, he imagined the boy more vividly, red, haired like himself, fierce and fearless, the living proof that heaven smiled upon their love. The narrator's voice fades to a reverent hush. Faith had become flesh, and flesh had become faith. There was no border left between prayer and desire. Yet beyond the glow of candlelight, unease thickened. The court was divided. One faction knelt before Anne, as before a saint, their praises rising with her fortune. Another, quieter and older, whispered in corners, waiting for the turn of the tide. The nobility, the clergy, the common people each saw in her something different. Enchantress, saviour, heretic, queen. Everywhere, contradictions bloomed. Sermons praised Henry as the new David, while poets called him Solomon reborn. Yet behind the words lingered fear. For if this new Eve was truly chosen, what became of the old? And if the king could undo one sacrament, what else might he unmake? The line between divine and mortal had blurred. Whitehall had become a temple to certainty, and outside its gates waited a country still steeped in doubt. The narrator exhales, slow and steady. When men believe themselves chosen, their faith becomes indistinguishable from their will. Henry's will had never been stronger. Every sunrise brought new proclamations, new titles, new displays of royal devotion. The Queen's crest hung beside his own. The courtiers raised their cups to the New England being born within her womb. But history does not pause for belief. Even as the falcon banners fluttered in the winter wind, darker omens stirred. The monks prayed against her, the crowds murmured against him, and somewhere, beyond their knowledge, the first faint tremor of tragedy began to move. For love, once turned into mission, cannot remain gentle. It demands victory or sacrifice. And as the king's lips brushed the queen's stomach one last time before sleep, he whispered to the unborn child, "You are the proof that God is with us." The narrator lets the final sentence drift into silence, like the soft extinguishing of a candle. But God, as kings and lovers must learn, has never promised to choose sides. Ende? In September of the year 1533, as dawn spilled its pale gold across the chambers of Greenwich Palace, the sound of a newborn's cry pierced the stillness. The Queen's ladies, who had held their breath through the long night, broke into tears of joy. One of them ran through the corridors, skirts whispering over marble, to find the king. Henry waited just beyond the door, restless, proud, and afraid. When the cry came, he smiled. When the door opened, he stepped forward. And when he saw the small bundle in the nurse's arms, his stride faltered. Not a prince, a daughter. For a heartbeat, silence filled the gilded room. The air itself seemed to hesitate. Then, slowly, the king's face softened. He reached out his arms, gathered the child close, and whispered, "Though she be but a girl, she is still my blood." And the baby was named Elizabeth, after Henry's mother Elizabeth of York, the queen who had once united two warring houses. It was a name chosen not from disappointment, but from hope, a bridge between the past and the fragile future. Anne, pale and exhausted, watched from her bed. The labour had drained her, but her eyes glowed with quiet triumph. "If I can bear one child," she murmured to the women around her, "I shall bear another, and one of them will be a prince." And Henry believed her. The court erupted in celebration. Feasts were held for days. Musicians played through the afternoons, and fireworks lit the Thames by night. Letters of congratulations arrived from every corner of the realm, though each carried a note of careful phrasing, a hesitation that mirrored the country's divided heart. The Venetian ambassador, Marino Giustiniani, recorded the scene in his journal. The king and queen walk hand in hand. Their faces shine as the dawn. They seem to believe the whole world has been remade. And in a sense, it had. After years of struggle, of defiance and exile, of papal threats and political upheaval, England now had an heir, if not the one its king had imagined. The narrator's voice lowers, steady and soft. A daughter is still a beginning. But for a man who had torn heaven and earth apart to win a son, beginnings could taste like defeat. Even amid the music and laughter, shadows gathered. Queen Catherine of Aragon still lived, resolute and unyielding, refusing to acknowledge the annulment of her marriage. The Pope, Clement VII, had not recognized Henry's union with Anne. Across Europe, the courts of Spain and France whispered that the child Elizabeth was illegitimate, a princess in name only. But within the palace, those doubts were forbidden. The heralds declared the girl legitimate, the future of England. Bells rang across London. Sermons were preached, calling her a blessing from God. Anne clung to that belief. In the still hours of the night, when the palace slept and the fires dimmed, she would rise from her bed, cross the room, and look down into the cradle beside her. The infant's hair was a soft red gold, her features delicate and alert. Anne would rest her trembling hand upon the wooden edge and whisper to herself, "The time will come." How? Those words, the same she had once written years ago in her Book of Hours, returned to her like a half-remembered prayer. They had once meant destiny, triumph, divine promise. Now, in the hush of the nursery, they felt more like an incantation against fear, for beyond the lullabies and silks, she knew the truth. The king's patience was not eternal. His love, though fierce, was bound to his need for an heir, and the world beyond Whitehall did not love her as he did. Outside the palace gates, resentment stirred. The common people still called Catherine their true queen. Priests refused to bless Anne's name in mass. In the markets, whispers bloomed like weeds. Some called her the witch who ensnared the king. Others said she would never bear a son, that her womb was cursed for what it had taken. The narrator's voice falls to a near whisper, the cadence like a slow heartbeat. Joy and dread lived side by side, each feeding the other. For in every lullaby there was the echo of a prophecy, and in every prayer the shadow of its cost. Henry, meanwhile, pressed forward. He ordered the royal nursery to be fitted with the finest linens, the softest silks. Elizabeth's christening was held on the 10th of September, attended by nobles in glittering attire. She was carried beneath a canopy of crimson and gold, the same colours that adorned her mother's falcon emblem. Yet the guest list told a quieter truth. Catherine's supporters were absent, and the foreign ambassadors watched with guarded smiles. Still, Henry stood beside Anne, radiant and unshaken. He believed in destiny, in divine favour, in the righteousness of his own hand. He looked at his daughter and saw not failure, but the first step toward eternal legacy. The narrator breathes out the final lines like a prayer fading into candle smoke. They thought the world had turned in their favour. They thought God had spoken through the cry of a child. But faith, when bound to ambition, has its own language of warning. That morning in Greenwich, the palace shone brighter than ever. Musicians played, courtiers smiled. The king's laughter echoed down the corridors like sunlight on water, and beside her sleeping child, Anne whispered once more, her voice almost too soft to hear. The time will come. She was right. It would come, but not in the way she dreamed. After the birth of Elizabeth, the old hunger returned. The joy that had filled the palace soon hardened into expectation. A daughter was a beginning, but not the end Henry had demanded from God. Within months of the christening, every look, every prayer, every whisper in court began to turn again toward one word only: son. In the year 1534, Anne conceived for the second time. The news spread through Whitehall like sunlight breaking after storm. Courtiers smiled again. Henry was radiant, almost boyish with hope. A son would silence the whispers, sanctify the break from Rome, and prove once and for all that heaven favoured the king and his new queen. But the promise failed. In the 4th month, Anne miscarried. The court fell silent. Henry tried to hide his disappointment, speaking gently to her at first. He told her to rest, to have faith, to try again. Yet his eyes betrayed the tremor of doubt. For a man who had risked excommunication, rebellion, and blood for this marriage, the loss was more than personal, it was theological. The narrator's voice grows soft, almost tender. In the hush that followed, even the prayers seemed to hesitate. Anne withdrew from the world for a time. Her women carried away the linens, burned the sheets, and whispered to one another in the corners. She stayed in her chambers, staring out at the grey Thames, where winter light fell like ash upon the water. 1 year later, she conceived again. Hope, fragile but stubborn, returned to the palace. The chapels echoed with hymns of thanksgiving. Once more, Henry allowed himself to dream. But in the first weeks of 1536, before the child could quicken, the nightmare repeated. Another miscarriage, another silence. Anne wept, not for herself, but for what she knew was slipping away. Each drop of blood, each failed promise, was another stone laid upon the fragile bridge that had carried her from love to power, and each stone was cracking. Within the palace, the old factions stirred. Supporters of Queen Catherine, though she was by then exiled to Kimbolton Castle, found new strength. The Catholic nobles, long silent, began to whisper again. They called Anne's misfortunes the judgment of God, the divine punishment for a usurped crown. Outside the palace walls, the rumours spread like frost. In London's narrow streets, people murmured that the Queen's womb was cursed, that she was a witch who had bewitched the king into destroying his marriage and his soul. Pamphlets, forbidden but passed hand to hand, called her the concubine and spoke of divine retribution. Henry, who once defied popes and nations for her smile, began to drift away. He sought distraction in hunts, in feasts, in the company of those who could flatter him without memory. The warmth between them, once so blinding, now flickered faintly, like a candle struggling in the draught of power. The narrator's tone turns low, almost drowsy, like a lullaby sung through grief. Love, when mixed with fear, forgets its own reflection. Thomas Cromwell, the king's clever secretary, was among the first to sense the turning tide. He had risen with Anne, serving the cause of the new queen and the new church. But now, watching her falter, He saw opportunity in her fall. Her temper, once charming, had grown sharp with anxiety. Her words bold, cutting, earned her enemies faster than allies. In the whispering halls of Whitehall, admiration turned to unease. At night, Anne sat alone by the small fire in her private chamber. The light trembled across the walls, touching the old book of hours that had followed her from childhood. The same one she had touched at Hever, the same one in which she had written years before. The time will come. Now, her hand trembled as she opened it. She stared at the fading ink, the words almost erased by time and handling. Then, slowly, she took up a quill and added a line beneath. Perhaps it is coming now. The candle guttered. Outside, snow pressed against the windows. From somewhere distant, the chapel bell began to toll the thin, cold sound that carries too easily through corridors meant for ceremony, not sorrow. The narrator's voice, low and even, moves like breath across glass. There is a sound that lingers after faith, the sound of inevitability. In the dark, Anne closed the book. She held it to her chest as if it could still protect her, though she no longer believed in the safety of paper or prayer. She thought of the king of his restless silences, his sudden laughter that no longer reached his eyes. She thought of Elizabeth, the child who smiled and reached for her hair. And she thought of the countless eyes watching her, waiting not for her next smile but her next mistake. In the stillness she whispered, almost to herself, "If God is with us, why does he feel so far?" The fire cracked softly. The bell stopped ringing, and in that silence, the kind that comes not from peace but from the slow gathering of fate, Anne Boleyn sat perfectly still, a queen at the height of her power, and already half a ghost. The narrator closes the scene with a voice as faint as the last shimmer of light. No one remains chosen forever. Even those who rise by prophecy must, at last, bow to it. Thomas Cromwell had once been Anne Boleyn's ally, the sharp mind who forged the path that led Henry VIII away from Rome. He was the architect of reform, the man who had helped tear down an old world so that Anne's new one might rise. But by the spring of the year 1536, he had become her enemy. He understood the rule that governed every court. A queen's power lasted only as long as her womb did. Anne had failed to give the king a son. That failure, though born of chance, was a political catastrophe. For Cromwell, whose survival depended on the king's favour, she was no longer a blessing but a danger. The king had grown cold first in words, then in gaze, then in touch. He spoke of Anne rarely, and when he did, it was with irritation, as though her very presence reminded him of broken promises and fading glory. Cromwell, sensing the shift, began to plan. He needed a way to remove the queen while keeping the king's conscience unblemished. And so, in May of 1536, the machinery of accusation began to turn. The charges were shocking, designed to both destroy and humiliate. Adultery, treason, and the darkest of them all, incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. One by one, names were gathered, stitched into a tapestry of scandal. Mark Smeaton, the Queen's musician, Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, and one of the King's oldest friends, Francis Weston, a young courtier who had once written poems in Anne's honour, and George Boleyn himself, her beloved brother, the man who had shared her childhood laughter and her rise to power. Each was arrested, each was interrogated, and under torture, confession became a formality. Smeaton, broken on the rack, confessed to adultery with the Queen. Whether his words were true or forced hardly mattered. Truth was no longer the concern of state. The other men, protesting innocence, were condemned nonetheless. Anne was taken to the Tower of London. The same fortress whose gates had once opened to her as a coronation queen now received her as a prisoner. 3 years earlier, she had walked its halls in triumph, crowned and radiant, as the people cheered. Now, she entered under guard, her falcon banner replaced by the silent watch of iron pikes and cold stone. When the charges were read aloud, she lifted her head and spoke clearly. "If my body has been unfaithful to my Lord, then may God take my soul this very moment." Her words were calm, But the guards said later that her hands trembled only once when she heard her brother's name among the accused. But law, once summoned, is seldom merciful. The accusations were already written, the verdict already chosen. To be guilty of treason against the king was to be guilty of death. The narrator's voice slows, wrapped in quiet grief. In the kingdom she had helped to create, there was no refuge left for her. The crown that had lifted her now weighed upon her like a blade. In the cold of the tower's night, Anne prayed. She wore a gown of grey, her hair unbound. The flicker of the single candle threw her shadow against the wall, a wavering figure between sainthood and sorrow. Outside her chamber, guards changed shifts in silence. The air smelled of damp stone and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cried from the battlements. Above the tower gate, Anne's falcon emblem hung upside down, a symbol of disgrace. Its wings no longer spread but folded in surrender. Cromwell wrote his final report to the king, in a hand both cautious and triumphant. "Your Majesty, all is now ready." Henry read it without expression. The years of love and faith and laughter between them were gone, swallowed by duty, by fear, by the endless hunger of power. He set the letter aside and spoke only once. "Bring me the finest executioner in France." The request was a mercy of its kind. The French swordsman, famed for his skill, would ensure that death came swiftly, without the roughness of an English axe. But mercy, like love, was now only a shadow of what it had been. The narrator's tone drops to a whisper. And so the Queen who had remade England waited for morning, knowing that her dawn would never come again. In the tower, Anne knelt by her narrow bed. Her lips moved without sound, her eyes turned upward. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, London slept, unaware that by the next sunrise, the woman who had changed their faith and their fate would be gone. The guards outside crossed their halberds. The candle guttered, then steadied. And in that pale, trembling light, Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, folded her hands over her heart. The falcon had fallen, and yet, in her silence, there was still the faint echo of defiance, the same whisper she had once written long ago. "The time will come." Now it had. Morning, the 19th of May, the year 1536. The air above the Tower of London was cold, clear, and still. Anne Boleyn awoke early in her royal prison chamber, the same set of rooms that had once been prepared for her coronation, now stripped bare for her end. She had slept little, though her attendants said she seemed calm. She asked for a light breakfast, some bread, a little wine, and ate quietly while the dawn seeped through the narrow window. Then she knelt to pray. Her words were simple, steady. She prayed for the king, for her daughter, for mercy. She did not ask for justice, only for grace. When she rose, her face was pale but serene. Outside, the courtyard was hushed. The scaffold stood ready, a low wooden platform draped in straw, built near the old chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The French swordsman sent for by Henry himself waited, his blade curved and shining. The witnesses gathered. A few guards, the constable, a small crowd of courtiers, and those permitted from the city. No drums, no trumpets, just the sound of the wind brushing the river below. Anne stepped onto the platform, her gown of grey damask fluttering slightly in the breeze. Her dark hair had been tucked beneath a simple linen coif. She carried herself with the composure of one who had already passed beyond fear. The chroniclers wrote that she smiled faintly as she looked toward the crowd, toward the same walls that had once echoed her triumphs. Before kneeling, she spoke softly, her voice carrying in the cold air, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. I submit me to the will of the king, my master. I pray God save him, and send him long to reign over you." Then, lower, almost in a whisper meant for no one but heaven, "Lord Jesus, have mercy on my soul." The narrator's voice slows, wrapped in a kind of reverent stillness. And then she turned her face northward toward the place where her little daughter, Elizabeth, slept and smiled. A moment of silence followed. Even the gulls above the river seemed to hold their cry. The swordsman, kneeling to ask her pardon, murmured in French that he was sorry. She nodded once. He called softly to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." As the man stepped away, Anne knelt straight and still, her hands folded in prayer. The Frenchman's trick, born of mercy, was to distract her. He called out suddenly for his servant, "Fetch my sword." And as Anne turned her head slightly, the blade flashed through the morning light. No sound, no cry. Only the whisper of steel through air. The head fell cleanly. A sigh passed through the onlookers, part prayer, part disbelief. The falcon had fallen. The narrator's tone falls to near silence. And thus, the prophecy in her book of hours was fulfilled. The time will come, she had written, and now it had. Anne Boleyn was buried within the chapel beside the scaffold, without stone or ceremony. The French executioner departed that same day, well paid for his precision. By evening the tower was quiet again, as though nothing had happened. But history had already shifted. Within 24 hours, Henry VIII dressed in white, declaring himself a widower. Within a few days more, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The machinery of power never paused. Love, faith, and death were all part of its rhythm. Still, the shadow of Anne remained. It lingered in the corridors of Whitehall, in the hut of the chapel, in the mirror where Henry sometimes stared too long at his own reflection. The woman he had destroyed had become inseparable from the man he had become. Years later, when his hair thinned and his leg ached, those who served him said they sometimes heard him speak her name under his breath. Neither curse nor prayer, but something in between. And the child he had once greeted with disappointment, the little girl in whose direction her mother had smiled one last time, would rise to the throne. Elizabeth, Queen of England, would reign for more than 44 years. Under her rule, the island that had torn itself apart through passion and faith would find its most enduring identity. The narrator's voice softens, each word drifting like embers into sleep. The love that split a kingdom would give birth to an empire. Up so, the tower remains. Its stones remember. The courtyard where she knelt still breathes with morning wind, and sometimes in the hush between the hours, the air itself seems to whisper her final words. "Lord Jesus, have mercy on my soul." Then, as the music fades, the narrator speaks one last time, gentle, almost like a lullaby. "Sleep now, for every tragedy, no matter how vast, must one day fade into silence. The swords grow dull, the hearts that broke are dust, and even the brightest crown, once cast aside, lies still beneath the quiet earth." And with that, the story closes softly, like the falling of a feather. And now, as the story fades, the noise of the world begins to soften. The tower grows distant, its stones sinking back into shadow. The sound of the river still flows beyond its walls, gentle, steady, eternal, washing over everything that once burned, once bled, once mattered too much. History, after all, always ends the same way, not with a cry, but with a whisper. Anne Boleyn's name, spoken once in anger and adoration, now drifts like dust across the centuries. The crown that gleamed above her head is long gone. The sword that struck her is cold iron in the ground. And yet, her story remains not as tragedy alone, but as a quiet reminder of how fragile power is, and how fierce the human heart can be. If you listen closely, beneath the rustle of pages and the hush of time, you can still feel her presence, not the doomed queen on the scaffold, but the woman who once dreamed of love, of purpose, of a child's laughter, echoing down a corridor of gold. Perhaps that is what endures most. Not the politics, not the pain, but the trace of something human, the longing to be seen, to be remembered, to leave behind more than silence. Anne's life, for all its fire and fall, gave birth to something larger than herself. The daughter she left behind would grow into one of the greatest monarchs the world has ever known. From the ashes of heartbreak came a golden age. From a whisper in a prayer book came the sound of an empire being born. And maybe that is the message hidden beneath it all, that nothing we give from love is ever truly lost.